Shobaman, shenman, kristes Almo din was obelza
That was the troparion of the Nativity. The words were, "Your Nativity, O Christ our God, has shone to the world the light of wisdom. For by it, those who worship the stars were taught by a star to adore you, the Son of Righteousness, and to know you, the Orient from on high. O Lord, glory to you." So the chief prayer from Christmas in the Orthodox tradition, sung in Georgian chant. John Graham, the director of the Aghsavali Ensemble, has sat down to talk with us about this. John, thank you very much for coming in.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting us.
Perhaps you can give us a bit of background on the context of this. Troparion, I tried to explain a little bit briefly, but perhaps you could say a bit more.
Sure. This is a text that went along with biblical texts. They're very old. They were written in Greek, probably in the 7th, 8th century, and translated into Georgian somewhere around that period, maybe a little bit later, by figures like Giorgi Kobaidze, who worked at the Iviron Monastery in Greece. And then these texts were collected in large Irmologian manuscripts and sent back to the Tbilisi period or region in Georgia. And from there disseminated through various books around Georgia. And we continue to sing these ancient texts for all of the feast days in the Orthodox calendar.
So this troparion text, which we just heard you sing, it's not a Christmas carol, it's more like a kind of main prayer that Christians would hear, Orthodox Christians will be hearing when they go to church on.
That's right. This particular text would be sung just for the service of the Nativity, during the Vespers service on the previous day, and then the Divine Liturgy as well. But since we will be performing an all-night vigil for Shoba, for Nativity this year, we'll have the Vespers, Matins, and Divine Liturgy service all together. And we'll sing this troparion text several times, but it's not otherwise sung throughout the calendar year.
Right, so you mentioned a little bit about the origins of Georgian music, how these texts came to Georgia, and how the music tradition developed. You talked about that a little bit. Some people who don't know very much about Orthodox Church music might be wondering what's the difference between Georgian music, Greek music, Russian music. They might have heard Russian music, where kind of, whereas Georgian church music slightly different, but it's three voices, right? And what characterizes Georgian church music?
Oh, that's a great question. It's really a unique music system, and it's tied closely to Georgian folk music, which is all three-part harmony, or the majority of it. But within Georgia, even though it's a small country on a map, it's so mountainous. It's very, very culturally diverse with multiple languages spoken and many different kinds of folk music sung in all the regions. And the sacred music kind of reflects that harmonic diversity. So scholars think that these melodies probably came from Palestine early on, 4th century, 5th century, and at that time they were probably monophonic, that is to say, one-voiced chant. But at
some churches still keep this tradition.
Right, the Greeks still sing that, Syrians, Antiochians, even in the Latin West, in the Catholic Church, the origins of chant there, Gregorian chant, that's a monophonic, single-voice tradition that many people might sing together, but they're singing the same melody. But something strange happened in Georgia, where at a certain point, this monophonic chant tradition became polyphonic, that is to say, multi-voiced, three-voiced, and that was probably a transition from the Georgians having this folk music that was three-part harmony. That's how they liked to sing. That's how they wanted to venerate God and the saints with the best voice that they could, was to sing in the manner that they knew how. So at a certain point, and it's debated when this was, 9th century, 11th century, who knows, these melodies were harmonized into three-voiced harmony, and then various different harmony traditions exist in Georgia based on the regions, as I was saying.
Or maybe they just wanted to be better than the Greeks. Like the Greeks had one voice, and Georgians were like, well, we have three.
Well, it's not necessarily better. More is not better in this case. Both have their merits. The Greek chanting tradition is absolutely marvelous, and people that love that music, would prefer it over any other. But Georgians, I think, they prefer their three-part harmony, and they're going to stick to it.
Absolutely. Well, why don't we listen to a little bit more? What's the next piece you're going to perform for us?
The next piece is also a text from the Nativity service. It's Raodenta kristes mier, and this text, or the harmony that we'll be singing again, like the first chant we sang, is from the Gelati Monastery in central Georgia. So the harmony is from there, and the translation is, as many as have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. Alleluia.
Excellent. So, members of the ensemble, take your places.
Kristes mier nate Raodenta
Yes, thank you very much. As many as have been baptized into Christ have become Christ. Hallelujah. So that would be sung during the Divine Liturgy on Christmas Day, just before the readings would start. So the Divine Liturgy, like the Orthodox Mass, maybe, to put it into context for some of our listeners, sung just before the readings, the New Testament reading and then the Gospel reading in the church liturgy.
That's right.
I have a question. So this, you talked a little bit about the relationship, possible common origins between folk music and liturgical music. How distinct are these traditions and how are they linked?
Oh, that's a great question. So first of all, folk music, there's just literally thousands of folk songs here in Georgia, and some of them are just fantastic. The most beautiful music you've heard. A lot of them had a function in an agrarian society. They're work songs. They're specific to threshing wheat or scything hay. Some of them are healing songs for healing the sick children, or casting out the lords, the so-called demons that would come and inhabit the sick children. Whereas others were just entertainment songs or had a historical function. They would tell some story. And these were largely improvised. Some of them, especially the joke songs, the texts were improvised, and certainly the music was semi-improvisatory. Now, the liturgical music was a bit more fixed. Like I said, there were these melodies that were inherited, and those melodies could not be changed. In fact, they were systematized into a complex categorization system that's called the Rvachma Sistema, the 8-mode system, or in Greek it's called the octaikos. And these melodies were assigned to specific tones, 1 through 8, and each tone would have a certain number of designated melodies that were assigned to it, and uniquely assigned. So something like the troparion we sang today was tone 4, and the melodies for tone 4 in a troparion cannot be sung in tone 5, or they can't be sung in another genre like a Irmoy tone 4 or Kondakian tone 4. No, the melodies have to be specifically for troparion tone 4, and this helped the master chanters in what was an oral tradition. This music wasn't written down. It helped them to remember all of these melodies and all of these chants. We're talking about 250 unique phrase-length melodies and maybe up to 3,000 texts that were, of course, written down. They didn't have to memorize the text, but they had to be in the moment. They had to prepare like we're preparing now for the Nativity service. They had to prepare by taking this unique text that's only sung once a year and set it to these melodies that they already knew. And then on top of that, they had to harmonize the melodies into 3-voiced harmony. And the way they did that was to go back to their knowledge of folk music. So here's the intersection. That you have this rich folk singing tradition that went along with all aspects of daily life in an agrarian lifestyle. And these harmonizations were so familiar for the master chanters that they could recall their melodies, let's call them model melodies, and then instantly harmonize them according to their local folk traditions. So that's the connection between the sacred music and folk music. I will also say that there are a number of folk songs that have a kind of para-liturgical function. So they weren't work songs, they weren't healing songs or historical ballads, but they really went hand in hand with specific large feast days. So for Easter, for example, there's this genre of para-liturgical folk song called the chona. And the chona have to do with older texts that have to do with fertility rituals that probably go back to pre-Christian belief systems.
So these are kind of like Christmas carols, like they're not necessarily
those are
part of the
Easter
church
carols.
service, they're like outside, around and about.
Exactly. And here at the Nativity season, we have a similar genre, and they're called Alilo, which is probably a Georgian version of Alleluia. And this genre of songs, and nearly every village in Georgia had their own musical variant and their own separate texts. This genre of para-liturgical songs would be sung after the Nativity service and for the next 12 days. The villagers would go from house to house according to this tradition, and they would sing the Alilo at the gates of their neighbors, and the neighbors would invite everyone in for some toasts and some cookies and maybe some wine. And this was sort of an outpouring of generosity and good cheer in the winter season. It's similar to Christmas caroling elsewhere in the world. So this is the tradition of Alilo, and there are lots of different variants.
One of which we'll hear in a little bit, but I still have some questions for you. I'm interested in, I mean, you mentioned that this was an oral tradition, but presumably that makes it also quite vulnerable historically if there are not, manuscripts written down. Was there ever a period in the tradition of Georgian liturgical music where this tradition was under threat?
Yes, under dire threat, in fact. I could say that, Georgian history being what it is, with so many invaders, so many great powers constantly coming into this region, starting from the Persians to the Turks, Mongols, Arabs were here in Tbilisi for 400 years, as we know. So the tradition, the musical tradition, was often under threat, but it evolved and it survived. But a more systematic threat came with, let's call it globalization, which started really in the early 1800s when the Russian Empire came here and brought European civilization. And this was the beginning of a long decline in the oral tradition, not just of sacred chant, but also of folk music through the 1800s, such that by the 1860s, a committee was formed called the Committee for the Preservation of Georgian Church Chant. And the reason that they needed that committee is because they could hardly find any master chanters in the country who still remembered the requisite repertory for, let's say, the Nativity service. They just didn't know how to set the Nativity troparion text to the model melodies. There were very few people who could do that still already in the 1860s after about 50 years of decline. And so this committee, which was made up of aristocrats and ranking members of the Georgian Orthodox Church, they tried to find the last remaining masters and pay them to start new schools and have more students. And one of these was Grigol Karbalashvili, was an important master chanter here in East Georgia, and he was paid to start a school in the Bodbe convent in 1860, and later he was brought to Tbilisi to teach in the seminary. And his 5 sons and a few of their friends were the last generation, let's say, of master chanters of the East Georgian liturgical music tradition. And this was, I don't want to blame the Russian suppression of the Georgian Orthodox Church, which was certainly a big part of the reality of the 19th century, but really it was a process of globalization where young people were becoming exposed to new kinds of music and new kinds of traditions, and it was just a loss of tradition. So that was the first major threat to the oral tradition. And what happened as a result is that starting in the 1880s, a lot of these chants were written down in European notation, and that act alone probably saved this tradition. Some 20,000 pages of notation were written down between 1885 and about 1910, and those survived in Soviet archives. And those sources form the basis for the revival of this music today. And it's a good thing those transcriptions were written down from the last master chanters, because after they died, there was no more oral tradition. There weren't people with a living memory of all of this music. Rather, all we had was this paper, really, with pencil markings on it, and it was a very fragile, singular source. Some of it was published in the first decade of the 20th century, but then, as we know, the Bolsheviks came, completely suppressed the Georgian Orthodox Church. This chant its performance was completely forbidden, started in 1921. And even though the Orthodox survived in a lesser form throughout the 20th century, the music that was sung in the church was not of the traditional music as inherited through the oral tradition. It was rather newly composed chants.
And most people who were in connection with the tradition were dying out, presumably during this time as well.
Right. Most of the master chanters had already passed away, and one of the last ones was Anton Dumbaidze in 1907. And then the man responsible for notating a lot of these chants from the masters, Giorgi Kobaidze, he dies in 1911. And a lot of people that were involved in the movement, they die in that first decade. And a couple of people that were known master chanters live into the mid-20th century, but they were forbidden from chanting and therefore forbidden from teaching any students. So if we look at the tradition as a whole, it was a strong oral tradition in the early 1800s, went into decline during the Russian imperialist period. It was notated in the 1880s and then fully suppressed in around 1920.
And presumably now, though, with the revival in church attendance in Georgia, interest in the Orthodox Church, and actually, in my experience as well, world interest from other parts of the Orthodox world, lots of interest in Georgia, presumably now the chant tradition is quite healthy, you'd say?
I would say, thanks be to God for that. It was starting in 1989. A few members a few students really at the conservatory formed a choir that later became the Aghsavali Church Choir. And members of that choir went in and they found these old transcriptions from the 1880s that had somehow, implausibly, survived in a Soviet archive, even though they'd been locked away and no one had been able to really study them for more than 60 years. They were able to gain access in 1989, begin singing these songs and chants somewhat clandestinely, and eventually starting to republish those transcriptions and produce audio CDs of these chants. And the Aghsavali Church Choir has really had a strong role in rebuilding this traditional church chant tradition here in Georgia, such that now I would consider Aghsavali to be a student choir of the Aghsavali Church Choir, and in our generation there are maybe 50 choirs, and perhaps in another generation, there will be another 50 or even 500. So I would say yes, the singing tradition now is very healthy, and it coincides with the rebirth and revival of the Georgian Orthodox Church as a whole, and all of the arts that are associated with that, be it stone carving, architecture, embroidery, and basically, having a lot more people involved in the churches, priests, deacons, acolytes, chanters. The church is very much reviving, in a revival state right now, and therefore chant has had a remarkable rebirth considering where it was in 1988.
Well, it's been a fascinating story from the very beginnings of Georgian chant all the way
there's so much more too.
Yeah, all kinds of interesting characters, from farmers and monks and chanters, aristocrats. It's been a very interesting story, very interesting to talk to you. I've been speaking to John Graham, who is a member of Aghsavali Ensemble. They're going to play us out, or as it will, sing us out, with one more piece. Let me just say thank you to them all first of all. Zaza, Giorgi, Saba, and Guga, thank you very much. And John, of course. Thank you all very, very much for coming in. Final thing that you're going to perform for us, John, if you just come back to the mic and let me know, is Anne.
Yes, so this is one of those para-liturgical folk songs that we were talking about. It's an Alilo, and the text will be very familiar. It says, on the 25th of this month, Christ was born, Alilo. Let those who bring the news be blessed. May God give you everything. Let those who bring the news be blessed. It's Christmas morning, Alilo.
Lovely. So lovely words to get us into the mood for Christmas. Thanks very much, John.
Thank you for
listening.
O tzadam
Thank you. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, that was fun.
That was great.
Thank you.
Let's take some pictures.